be.
I was the viewer, not the viewee.
Very good.
Hey, Alan, I like the bear in your background.
Well, thank you. That's Meals on Wheels.
Lori and Mark, good to see you.
I love it.
Hi, Barbara. Kathy, good to see you too. Fred Shaw, wow, good to see you.
Yeah, how are you?
Wonderful.
I thought I'd take a break for
Let's
lunch.
go ahead and start a little bit. We have some more people coming. Lunch and Learn is to differentiate it from what we do on Tuesday. Tuesday is more Parashat Shavua and a class where we will look at the Torah portion of the week. And Lunch and Learn, we have all kinds of different topics. And we've been focusing in my sections on responsa literature, etc. So I wanted to continue that, but in preparation for where I really wanted to go, I needed to get a little background on Reform Judaism, the Reform Jewish principles. The responsa that I want to look at in maybe a little bit this week if we have time, but certainly in the subsequent weeks, will be those dealing with conversion. And that plays into the most recent High Court decision in Israel about the acceptance of conversions by the state from those who go through the rabbinic channels of the conservative or reform movements. But and I don't know. I thought maybe you covered that a little bit last week, or maybe you didn't. But I wanted to make sure that as we get to that everyone is clear that they were referring to the reform movement and the conservative movement in Israel, right? So that the High Court, what they were deciding was the application of the law of return vis-a-vis those people who are in Israel who are not Jewish, who then go to the reform or conservative Israeli rabbis for the conversion process and how the state acknowledges it or not. It does not impact on the reform and conservative or modern Orthodox movements here in the United States or in Europe or Australia or wherever, because since 1970 on, the law of return has always applied to us. So when someone comes through Reform Judaism or conservative Judaism and becomes a Jew, they are automatically eligible to move to Israel, become a citizen of Israel according to the law of return. So there's a little bit of confusion about that. So as I wanted to unpack that ruling and also look at Reform Judaism in Israel a little bit, I wanted to start from the beginning, and that is, well, what is the process for becoming a Jew according to Reform Judaism? And even before that, what are the principles of Reform Judaism? And I don't think that's a topic that we have addressed, at least not recently. So I wanted to spend some time today looking at the most recent principles of Reform Judaism as they were passed some 20 years ago. They are updated every 25 years or so. So it's not unlikely that as soon as we cover this material, there will be another committee in the CCAR, the URJ, who is determined to have yet another statement of principles about Reform Judaism. But this is the one that we have. So as we're about to study Judaism and Torah, we say the blessing, Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kadoshanu mitzvotav la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise you, Adonai, our God, creator of the universe. You've sanctified us with mitzvot, and you commanded us to engage with words of Torah. And that's what this is about, trying to find out, well, what are the principles first that we're talking about, and then how they apply. So after my rather long preamble, thank you for tolerating it. I wanted to see if they have any questions. Mel and Roberta, good to see you as well. Rhonda, good to see you, or Neil. I don't know if that's Neil or Rhonda. Arnie, you had a question?
Just a quickie. In Israel now, as the right of a rabbi, a reformer conservative rabbi, to perform a ceremony, has that been changed?
No, that's not changed. So here's the deal. In Israel, still the only weddings and other ceremonies, all of that goes through the interior ministry of the Knesset, of the Israeli government. And since that is almost always controlled by the ultra-Orthodox parties, the Haredi parties, they are very zealous about excluding anyone who's not one of them. That includes regular Orthodox. I mean, there are Zionist Orthodox rabbis and modern Orthodox rabbis who are also excluded because they're not of that ultra-Orthodox Haredi camp. So they zealously guard who will do the weddings, who will determine what is kosher, the certificates that you have for a restaurant. And they use that for their political power. They also use that for their financial power. And there's some abuse of that power. And that's part of what the High Court was addressing. So when someone comes to a Reform or conservative or more modern Orthodox rabbi in Israel and wants to have a wedding, they first have to go outside of Israel to have some other state, some other nation declare the wedding. So frequently in Israel, for instance, they'll go to Cyprus. Plenty of them come here, the United States. And I've done many weddings with a couple who are going to be living in Israel or are already living in Israel. They come here and they do a wedding, and we can even have a little ceremony here. But when they go back to Israel, they'll have another ceremony as well, in order to have a ceremony that's in keeping with their understanding and practice of Judaism, because they didn't want to have the Haredi or the ultra-Orthodox run their service. Susan, when Jeremy and Madeline were married, were they married by Haredi?
The first time they were married by a judge at
Was
the
that
courthouse.
Here? Yeah, good.
The second time they were married by, I don't know, is he a Haredi? I don't know. Rabbi Lieben.
Oh, in Israel?
No, here.
Oh, here. Oh, okay,
So
good.
they could go back to Israel and be accepted because they were married by an Orthodox rabbi in a wedding versus in the courthouse.
So, I mean, so it's still a long process. This court thing, and we will look at it more in more
It's
detail
awful.
later on. But it's a mess because most Israelis are not Haredi, and their exercise of the freedom of the practice of Judaism is very much confined by the restrictions of the Haredi. So, any other questions on this? Okay, well, good. So who's read through the principles of Reform Judaism before, with the exception of Janet? Janet, I'm sure that you had a copy of it in your office at a manual, didn't you? Why not? Okay, so go ahead, Linda.
It's been a long time ago, but Rabbi Telrov gave a lunch and learn one year, and it was 2 or 3 sessions, and we talked about the principles of Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Judaism here in the United States. I found it very interesting. I think I kept the paperwork from those classes, but I haven't looked at it in a while.
Yeah. So one of the classes that we have done in the past was to look at the evolution of those principles from the original principles that were in, 1880 or something like that, 1885, the Columbus platform, that was with the Reform movement, and then not the Columbus. It was actually in Pittsburgh. That was back in the 1880s. And then there was one that was the Columbus, and then there was the San Francisco in 1976, and then there was this one in the year 1998 or something. We'll see that in just a second. And so, looking at that evolution of the Reform principles is interesting in its own mark. But what I want to do is to see where we are right now, because that's going to impact on our understanding of the conversion process, of where we stand as a movement, because that's what is being called into question by some of the Haredi opposition to this high court ruling. And that is, well, what Reform and conservative is not authentic. And I mean, for want of a better word, although they wouldn't say it in such polite ways. And so obviously we disagree with that, but before we disagree with it, we should know what the heck we're talking about. What are those Reform principles? And so with that, I'd like to bring up the shared screen and start to look at them. Is that large enough? Okay, you guys can unmute so I can hear you. Otherwise, I think that my ears are plugged up. So who'd like to read our preamble? This again is the latest of the principles, 1999, obviously. Who'd like
Since Alan Senior's not here, I'll read it.
Okay.
On 3 occasions during the last century and a half, the Reform Rabbinate has adopted comprehensive statements to help guide the thought and practice of the movement. In 1885, 15 rabbis issued the Pittsburgh Platform, a set of guidelines that defined Reform Judaism for the next 50 years. Excuse me. Next 50 years. Revised Statement of Principles. The Columbus Platform was adopted by the Central Conference of American Rabbis in 1937. A third set of rabbinic guidelines, the Centenary of American Rabbis in 1937.
Centenary Perspective appeared in 1976 on the occasion of the centenary of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Then start with today.
Today, when so many individuals are striving for religious meaning, moral purpose, and sense of community, we believe it is our obligation as rabbis once again to set of principles that define Reform Judaism in our own time.
Very good. Thank you, Alan. So
you're welcome.
Let's look at what those are. And they're going to divide this up into 3 basic categories: God, Torah, and Israel, which are the traditional pillars of Judaism. Our faith, our the sacred literature that informs our sense of moral purpose and ethical purpose, of sacred duty and responsibility. Our Torah, our Talmud, our Mishnah, the responsa, the philosophy, even the history of our people, that all is Torah. And Israel, meaning not just Medinat Yisrael, the land of Israel, because let's face it, for much of the last 2,000 years, most Jews have not lived in the land of Israel. And probably, if you want to get demographically correct, we haven't had most Jews live in the land of Israel since the destruction of the Second Temple. We had the exile of the Jewish community from Israel by the Babylonians in the year 586 before the Common Era. And so we were exiled to Babylon. Even upon the return, there was an enormous community of Jews in Babylon and Persia. There was another enormous community of Jews in what would be modern day Egypt. And so for the last 2,500 years plus, most Jews have lived in the diaspora. So when we refer to Israel, it's not just the land of Israel, it's Bnei Yisrael, it's the people of Israel. So God, Torah, and Israel is that connection of who we are as a people, as a family, our faith, connecting with God, and the recordings, the writings, the expressions of that people that we have recorded in Torah, what we call Torah with the generic small t, i.e. All of the literature of Judaism, and not the large T being Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Any questions on that before we get to the first one, which is God? Okay. Okay, so who's going to start us with God?
I can read, Rabbi.
Okay, let Linda go, and then Barbara, you'll be next, okay?
Okay, no problem.
We affirm the reality and oneness of God, even as we may differ in our understanding of the divine presence. We affirm that the Jewish people is bound to God by an eternal brit, covenant, as reflected in our varied understandings of creation, revelation, and redemption. We affirm that every human being is created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that therefore every human life is sacred. We regard with reverence all of God's creation and recognize our human responsibility for its preservation and protection.
Right. Now, this is not a simple statement. This is a major statement. And there are responsa that we will look at some point when it comes to the conversion process, as can someone who doesn't believe in God, who says, I'm an atheist, I don't believe, but they, for instance, would keep kosher. And maybe they are, very positive about just about every other aspect of Jewish life, but say, you know what, I just don't have any faith whatsoever. Would that be a disqualification? And that's an interesting question. What about, and here's another responsum that had to be addressed by both the rabbis of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Reform Movement, and the Reform Movement in its totality, had to consider the acceptance of a congregation that declared itself to be humanist, i.e. they had as their founding principle that they would not believe in God. They said, we are not God-centric, we are humanists, but we would like to be a part of the URJ, of the Union for Reform Judaism. Well, at the time it was the Union of American Hebrew Congregation, UAHC. And they said, why? Because we want to be able to send our kids to camp, and we want some of the educational materials, and we want to be a part of the larger movement. They also wanted to test the boundaries of the URJ and the UAHC. And so that's an interesting question as well. So let's continue on with God. And Barbara, why don't you continue this piece?
Okay. We encounter God's presence in moments of awe and wonder, in acts of justice and compassion, in loving relationships, and in the experiences of the everyday. We respond to God daily through public and private prayer, through study, and through the performance of other mitzvot, sacred obligations, Bein Adam al Makon to God, and Bein Adam al Hevero to other human beings. We strive for a faith that fortifies us through the vicissitudes of our lives, illness and healing, transgression and repentance, bereavement and consolation, despair and hope. We continue to have faith that in spite of the unspeakable evils committed against our people and the sufferings endured by others, the partnership of God and humanity will ultimately prevail.
Yeah, I thank you for doing vicissitudes. I didn't.
I have a question.
Yeah,
A friend of mine,
Yeah.
a friend of mine in Boulder just joined the humanistic group there. And so I went online and I was looking at it, and they refer to the belief in God as a supernatural power, which I found really fascinating.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for the humanist congregations. Obviously, they're not going to delve a lot into theology because that's not their thing.
Right.
But they do have their own prayer books. There was a Rabbi Wein, who was one of the founders of the humanistic movement. He was actually a graduate of Hebrew Union College, and he started a congregation. Then he went to Detroit, and there is a little bit of a movement, but I don't know how much they have a defined sense of a deity, whether it's a natural power or not. It's just not a part of their deal, which was a hard thing, because when you go into their services, in their prayer book, where's the expression of faith? Where's like the Shema? Where's what are they all about? And so I can't speak any more than that about it, other than that from one of their congregations to the next, they may not have great consistency.
So they can do their own thing.
Yeah.
My one interaction with them was I went to a funeral of a mother or father of a friend of mine, and it was on Saturday afternoon, and it bothered me that, okay, I can accept the non-acceptance of a deity and humanism and stuff like that, but somewhere there needs to be some ritual. Otherwise, why be Jewish? Because otherwise you're just a humanist congregation. And I don't know if you say there isn't like a central place, then maybe they don't all do that, but it kind of,
Yeah. Or Janet, you're probably familiar with a group, it started in New York, the Ethical Cultural Movement. And it also came from a couple of Reform rabbis. And if you go to the Ethical Cultural School in Manhattan on the West Side, it's a fabulous school. And it started basically as humanists, as saying, you know what, we want to be, if I could give it a term, although this is people who really are into it, they would object to it, but well, okay. It would be like Jewish universalism, the universalists, church, where they sort of like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And so they were going to they wanted to strive for a universal ethical and get away from the particular, and that was quite appealing, as was the Unitarian Universalist movement at some point in the United States. It was very big. It was actually quite big for some Jews who were finding it hard to be particularly Jewish because everyone else seemed to be Christian. They wanted to be able to blend in. Does anyone else have a memory or a thought about those experiences? No. Anyway, Unitarianism didn't catch on within the Christian circles, and that movement didn't catch on so much within Jewish either. And I think, Janet, for the same reason, we would come to it. First of all, we said, why are you doing a funeral on Shabbos? And also, if I'm going to have a congregation, I'm going to come together, there's got to be some meat there. There has to be something there other than be nice, be nice to each other. Okay, I know, but that's not enough to give us. It doesn't unify our a sense of identity or a sense of purpose or connect with our history. Janet.
Actually, I think it's more, to me, it's more that you don't create something out of what you're not and kind of anti something. You create things because of what you want to be.
Good. That's very well put. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone? Go, Arnie.
It's just very slippery slope. I mean, I was raised Orthodox. The first time I walked in to a Reform shul, I was looking for the baptism water to bless myself. So, the fact is the shul was full. So obviously it satisfied a lot of need for a lot of people. My youngest brother belongs to a reconstruction. And the Aron Kodesh is not in the middle. When I walked in, where's the Aron Kodesh? It's off to the side. But the place was packed. So it satisfied a need. Now, if when the place is empty, somebody's going to say, this ain't working. See what I mean? Therefore, I stop being critical about anything I see in any type of place of worship. The people are there, it's satisfying a need for them.
Right. I think that's very fair. Very good. Anyone else?
Yeah, then we have Jews for Jesus. I mean, where are we going to go with that one?
Well, I mean, that is a worthy topic. I mean, the exception being that are there Jews in the Jews for Jesus? I mean, for the most part, they're not Jewish. It's set up as a missionizing effort to convert Jews to Christianity, and so the people who are dominating within that in that movement are not Jewish whatsoever. They're just trying to missionize, to proselytize. Fred.
Yeah, at one time Pat Robertson supported, monetarily,
of course,
the Jews for Jesus movement.
Yeah.
I don't know if
there's that one in the Messianic. Those are they're competitors. They have different brands, but the same goal. Okay, Fred, and then Julia.
So, after listening last night to the session we had, with people involved talking about, anti-Semitism and the topic last night, change over time. I'd be curious to get your perspective on, we've had so many different versions of Judaism, different groups are popping up. What is causing all of that to create all these different versions? The basic Judaism culture of values is still there, hopefully. But why is this happening with so many different sects and groups more recently, or maybe in the last 50 to 100 years? Does that make sense?
Let me address that, but let's get to Julia's question first, and then we'll go back.
Okay.
I didn't really have a question so much as a comment, which was, so a lot of times I'll hear people, they'll call Reform Judaism Judaism light. And I don't really see it that way, but that's kind of the reputation it still has, even though, I grew up going to Temple Emmanuel and Temple Sinai, and it's always been rigorously Jewish. And then we joined in kind of egalitarian Orthodox temple when I was in high school, and it was really different, much more rigid. But it didn't feel less religious at a Reformed temple. It's just different.
Right.
And the main issue I always bumped up against between the two is my issue of being patrilineal descent and raised Jewish, but my whole family on my dad's side was Jewish, but because my mother wasn't, I technically wasn't. And so with the Orthodox, I actually had a conversion. We called it an affirmation because it was like not really a conversion. But technically, like having to jump through that hoop to be fully accepted in other denominations. And I feel like, because they were like, well, that just doesn't really count,
Thank you for that. There's actually one of the responses that I've pulled up for us to look at, if not this today, or then in the subsequent weeks, will be on the patrilineal question. And I think that's a big part of the conversion issue vis-a-vis the Israelis, because they don't have patrilineal. It's just a matrilineal piece. But I think you're 100% correct that it's an individual who makes the expression light. Within the Reform Jewish community that I've been associated with, I know I've been very impressed by members like yourselves who take it very seriously. They study, they're part of a community, they're there for the expression of Judaism in the highest of our values. And not just tzedakah, but the observance of our principles of making sure that there is a just society, of teaching our history, of living a Jewish lifestyle, of having a Jewish pride, of having a concern for the Jewish family and faith. So I've been blessed to have my life surrounded by Reform Jews who take it very seriously. But we also know that there are people who are belonging to any congregation, whether it's Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox, who make it light. Now, how would they make it light?
They don't go, they don't take
don't go.
part. They
Right,
just
they
don't
don't
go. That's what I've
Right.
noticed.
Right.
Like,
So,
you can make anything light.
exactly.
Like, I feel like I'm a very religious person, you know?
You're
But-
very, I agree.
Right.
I think you are too.
Like I think what I'm trying to say is that people look at Reform Judaism and they're like, well, you're just culturally Jewish. It's just lox and bagels. And I'm like, no, like I have a pretty rigorous life as a Reform Jew. I've just made decisions around why I'm Reform as opposed to Orthodox.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyway,
And
that's what I'm trying to say.
And
I could go on.
I would testify to that in court, Julia. How's that?
Julia, why does that bother you? That's what I want.
It bothers me because it's usually thrown at me as an accusatory thing. It's usually said, like, I'll be like, oh, we're members of a Reform congregation. And like, oh, that's just Jewish light.
Yeah.
Well,
And
the
I'm
person
like,
who's going to make that statement,
yeah.
why should you care?
That's just
I'm like-
ignorance.
I just don't understand the
I don't get it.
Jews against Jews. That's the thing I hate. I hate when, anyway,
Oh, God.
I'm with you 100%. And
because I defend Orthodox Jews to people who are anti-Semitic towards them. And I would like that same respect. But
well,
And I
That's
give
anyway.
a different perspective.
yes, please.
When I first joined Temple Sinai, I was looking to become more involved, and they had put out a request for individuals that were handy to put together some desks for the office. And I showed up with my tools, and I went in there, and we put together 3 desks that day, and there were a total of 5. So we're trying to figure out when we can all get together again to finish the other 2. And I started to get stuff like, well, Saturday's no good because I have soccer for my kids. And someone else said, yeah, no, I have I have an appointment with a friend on Saturday. And I said, well, what about the fact that it's Shabbos? Why do you need any other excuse not to do this other than it's Shabbos? And that really, coming from the Orthodox vein, it's sort of like reinforced my initial thoughts about Reform Judaism, because to me, even though I joined the Reform synagogue, I wasn't going to do that on Shabbos.
Yeah.
And I came back the following week, 2 different days by myself, and put the other 2 desks together, so that they had it. But I just find the attitude on a lot of people in our synagogue that they themselves cause the Jewish light type of moniker.
Right. Well, to be fair, and I hear you, Jerry. You find people in any group, in any experience, who are into it and who are doing it and who live up to the highest of the values, and others who aren't. And by the way, that plays out with marriages and friendships as well. And so I do not define myself ever by the lowest common denominator. I say, yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
I mean, that's the beauty of Reform Judaism, is to have the choice to live, to balance your secular life and your religious life, and not to judge. And And that's why we're involved. We've been involved in the reform movement for many, many years, because it just fits our needs and our beliefs.
Thank you. Go, Alan, quick. Thank you.
I thirst for classes at Temple, Emmanuel now here, and at Ollie. I want to learn. And that's my shtick. Other people don't do it, fine with me. Everybody has their own thing. And to get back to I don't like when people say, well, I'm Reform Judaism, so I could eat shrimp. I'm going to have shrimp tonight. That bothers me.
Yeah.
There are Orthodox who eat shrimp.
I know, exactly. They don't, and not at home. They won't. I'm not going to eat it at home. Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah. Somebody told my husband when he told them that, excuse me, that I'd had a Reform conversion. And again, Rabbi Zwarin just said, well, you're already Jewish because my father was Jewish. And I said, well, I just kind of want to make the commitment. Anyway, she said, well, oh, she's not a real Jew, huh? And the next time I saw her, I was at a shiva. She was holding the book upside down. And she,
trust me, she's less Jewish than you.
Yeah. And, isn't a member of a congregation, so it's like, you just, and I've gotten it was what got to me, and I'm going a little off track here. Surprise. Mike's laughing. Last night, there was a wonderful discussion with the three speakers who were converted and their journey. And I'm sitting there, and these are the African American members, and I'm sitting there going, yeah, I did that too. And it was so similar, until it boils down to race. But my journey to becoming Jewish was so close to the other three. I thought, oh, we got to form a club. It was just interesting.
No, but I think that's a very good, Kathy, because what they expressed also, and this is something that we need to address. We want to be open. We want to be empowering. We want to be accepting, non-judgmental, and yet one individual who makes a snide comment about someone who became Jewish, or about someone's color, or that they have something a little bit unique about them, that can make a person feel isolated and judged and excluded. And so we have to be very careful about the words we use, and also to be courageous enough when someone is being dismissive or judgmental about another person for any reason. Now, and it can be the pigmentation of their skin. It could be the color of their hair, or lack thereof, or their height, or their weight, or their gender, or their sexuality. Goodness sakes, leave people alone. Let's find a home, build a home where we can all celebrate our family and not isolate each other. So I thought what they said last night was wonderful and courageous, and
well, variety. The thing is that Jews are from all over, okay, and the variety, especially of Reform Judaism, I feel is what keeps us growing, expanding, making ourselves and the world better. You can't exist on meatloaf and mashed potatoes alone. You got to put some green beans in there. But you know what I mean? Yeah, and a little salsa. You know what I mean? It's just variety's the spice of life. The cliche, and it's just so true. The more variety, the better.
I want to add something.
Alan, go ahead. I want to get to Fred.
Yes, thank you. You just got me to a senior moment. Oh, I remember when we were told that by encouraging facilitators that if someone converts, don't say that this person converted. He or she is a Jew. So then I shake my head when someone who's converted says, well, when I was a Christian, and it always troubles me, but I'm getting used to it.
Well, you know what? Because they don't want to hide their journey. They're proud of their journey.
Right.
And it's one thing for someone to talk about their journey, but it's a whole nother thing for someone who is from the outside saying, I know something about you, and therefore I'm going to make some kind of judgment thereon. Let me get to Fred's question. He said about, and Fred, you said that how come there's so many different varieties of Judaism now? And it used to be that everyone was just Jewish. It was never the case. We were all just Jewish. Never, ever, ever. So that the historians of Second Temple period, when there was a temple, right? They don't speak of Judaism. They speak of Judaisms, plural. Josephus talks about a number of different movements, including the Pharisaic movement and the Sadducean movement and the Essene movement and the Sicarii, the Zealots, nationalists. So there were a number of different movements at the same time. And then you say, well, even within the Pharisaic movement, what ultimately became the rabbinic movement, you had schools of Hillel and schools of Shammai. Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, though they had some, and maybe a lot, most practices that were very similar, they also had great disagreements, including what was the correct way to light a Hanukkah menorah. No, in the Reform movement, a conservative movement, the Haredi and Mea Sharim, we all light the Hanukkah menorah the same way. Hillel and Shammai, they disagreed as to how to do that, right? So there's never been within our people, and even think about it, doesn't even make sense. Can you imagine a group of Jews all wanting to belong to one movement?
No. Oh my gosh. No.
Right? It's not going to happen.
The Jews in my family don't even belong to one movement.
Right. A lot of people at Temple Sinai, they belong to other congregations too. It's like, yeah.
I guess I could see where some of these small things should not make a big enough difference to divert to another type of group. And so I'm looking at maybe some of these larger issues that are significant enough that cause movements, right? Why do we have movements? We have movements in our country in the last 50, 60 years with the blacks and the whites and everybody else. So it's just what causes, all of a sudden, well, somebody mentioned Reconstructionism, okay? And then even just the Reform movement. But I guess it's just my curiosity, because yeah, you're right. We can't all be the same, but we could still tie our shoes a little differently, but still be part of the same race.
And I think we do that. And one of the examples of that, and it's not just Denver, it's been in every community I've been, from New York into Pennsylvania. I grew up in Indiana, and all of these different places. And I know they have a strong in California, from one coast to the other. We have places where Orthodox, including Chabad, and Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionists come together. And we form a Rocky Mountain Rabbinic Council, for instance, where we all sit together and we find ways to cooperate. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have different synagogues and have some differences. Vive la différence. It's important to have a variety where people can have uniqueness of expression. And now we do it more by philosophical or theological decisions. Just 2 generations earlier, when we were more dominated by immigrant Jews who came in from Eastern Europe, especially, or Western Europe and Central Europe, you had the Litvaker Shul and the Russische Shul and the Germanische Shul and the Hungarian Shul, right? Everyone had, they organized around who was a landsman. Where am I want the melodies of what they used to have in Minsk or Pinsk or wherever. And so when they came to the United States, they organized according to those categories, and it was okay. It was all right. So I want to get back to, let's get back to this text real quick, because we're not going to exhaust this topic, and it's fabulous. So that was God in this reform principle. I want to get to the other two. The other is Torah. So who would like to read the, this is the reform principle of what we mean by Torah.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
We affirm that Torah is the foundation of Jewish life. We cherish the truths revealed in Torah, God's ongoing revelation to our people, and the record of our people's ongoing relationship with God. We affirm that Torah is a manifestation of Avat Olam, God's eternal love for the Jewish people and for all humanity. We affirm the importance of studying Hebrew, the language of Torah, and Jewish liturgy, that we may draw closer to our people's sacred texts. We are called by Torah to lifelong study in the home, in the synagogue, and in every place where Jews gather to learn and teach. Through Torah study, we are called to mitzvot, the means by which we make our lives holy. We are committed to the ongoing study of the whole array of mitzvot, and to the fulfillment of those that address us as individuals and as a community. Some of these mitzvot, sacred obligations, have long been observed by Reform Jews. Others, both ancient and modern, demand renewed attention as the result of the unique context of our own times. We bring Torah into the world when we seek to sanctify the times and places of our lives through regular home and congregational observance. Shabbat calls us to bring the highest moral values to our daily labor and to culminate the work week with Kiddushah, holiness, Menucha, rest, and Oneg, joy. The high holy days call us to account for our deeds. The festivals enable us to celebrate with joy our people's religious journey in the context of the changing seasons. The days of remembrance remind us of the tragedies and the triumphs that have shaped our people's historical experience, both in ancient and modern times, and we mark the milestones of our personal journeys with traditional and creative rites that reveal the holiness in each stage of life.
We bring Torah into the world when we strive to fulfill the highest ethical mandates in our relationships with others and with all of God's creation. Partners with God in Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, we are called to help bring nearer the Messianic age. We seek dialogue and joint action with people of other faiths in the hope that together we can bring peace, freedom, and justice to our world. We are obligated to pursue tzedek, justice, and righteousness, and to narrow the gap between the affluent and the poor, to act against discrimination and oppression, to pursue peace, to welcome the stranger, to protect the earth's biodiversity and natural resources, and to redeem those in physical, economic, and spiritual bondage. In so doing, we reaffirm social action and social justice as a central prophetic focus of traditional Reform Jewish belief and practice. We affirm the mitzvah of tzedakah, setting aside portions of our earnings and our time to provide for those in need. These acts bring us closer to fulfilling the prophetic call to translate the words of Torah into the works of our hands.
Yeah.
In all these ways and more, Torah gives meaning and purpose to our lives.
Right. Now, I find that an inspiring expression. I mean, in my mind, that's Reform Judaism, and it always has been. And Julian, I hear you very much. I think, and I look at each of your faces, and I know as you're engaged in Torah study, but not just study for the study's sake, but also for working those expressions into how we live our lives. And you've done it, and gosh almighty, I've been so privileged to be a part of a community that lives it, that walks the walk and not just talks the talk. And I think we could be very, very proud of that. It's a challenge too, because it's not always easy to live up to our highest ideals in anything we do. You know, I can say, okay, I'm going to, here's my new diet, or here's my new exercise routine. I'm going to do my best, but I'm not going to be perfect. And I'm not going to be a perfect Jew either, but I know what my principles are. I know what my values are. I know what I'm striving for. And I think that striving speaks to the meaning of what it means to be a Jew as an individual. I don't know who else wanted to weigh in on what we just read. Mel, please.
Just one thing. There was one sentence there where they talked about reevaluating things in terms of modern concepts. And it brought me back to the reading of the Megillah, which we have talked about previously, and that last section, the reading of the Megillah, where we went out and killed 75,000 people, if I remember correctly. Something that we would never want to do now. We'd rail against that. And yet there are some other things in Torah like that are abominable, and we do have to reevaluate them. And so I think that's a very important tenet of Reform Judaism.
Right. Not only, but looking back at the history of that, but it's also reevaluating. There may have been decisions by generations in the past to define, for instance, the role of what women can play in Judaism, and Reform has said, well, that was then. That's no longer reflective of what we understand to be Jewish principles. And so to have a woman like my Susan or Rabbi Jordy, who stands as a rabbi and a leader and a teacher in a community, we find that perfectly natural. Now, there are those in other communities who are not there yet, but we address those traditions and evolve them. By the way, there's certain things that we would have given up. The Reformed Jews who were a little bit more radical 100 years ago, 150 years ago, like the use of mikveh, right? And now Reformed Jews are more and more saying, mikveh is pretty cool. Let's go there, not just whether it's for conversion, but for other major milestone experiences in my life, or in anticipation for the Yontif, for an emotional or spiritual renewal. And so I was just at the mikveh yesterday as someone became Jewish, which I'm always so charged up by that. Someone who's been studying first with Susan and then with me for the last couple of years. And we got a conservative rabbi, and Susie and I came together and was just like, wow. And this mikveh was such an important part of this. This person was there in the water all by themselves. Well, there was a generation of Reformed Jews who said, no, we don't do mikveh. But now we go, mikveh is pretty cool, right? Yeah. And by the way, Mel and Roberta, early on, who grew up Reform? If you grew up Reform way back when, they didn't have bar bat mitzvah either, right? And very little Hebrew in the prayers. So the evaluation is not just looking back at at what our ancestors did in the Torah and the Megillah or whatever, but also what the previous generations of Reform Jews did, and say, you know what, that which they are no longer doing, we're going to reinvest some thought about that. This is I think this is that process. There was a wonderful book that we had in adult education 30 years ago. It's called Reform is a Verb. Someone may remember reading it. But we're continuing to reevaluate. I think if you're a Jew, if you're a caring, thinking person, you should continue to reevaluate and to rethink your decisions and your suppositions and say, is that still valid? Can I reimagine this in a different light, because things have changed? Yeah. Go ahead, please, Roberta, please.
I'm almost finished, and I just can't resist talking about the dentist in Seinfeld, who converted to Judaism. And then he started telling all the questionable Jewish jokes, and asked for a shtickle of dental floss.
I remember that episode.
Oh, crazy.
Very good.
That was Bryan Cranston. It was about
Yes.
one of the first times we saw.
Oh, is that? Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was so funny.
Oh, yeah.
Mark, go ahead.
One thing that I found that was unsettling to me when I started to study with Reform rabbis and also with your Orthodox rabbis, that each of them, if they were close to their graduation from yeshiva, that each of them seemed more, to me, were more aiming at disproving the other person's beliefs than to joining us in a group. And it really bothered me. It still bothers me. But then it just seemed like the purpose of a Reform yeshiva was to criticize the Orthodox and vice versa.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a waste of time. You should find the positive. Margie, go ahead. I know you wanted to.
No, I don't have anything.
Okay, good. I want to get to this last little section so that next time when we get together next week, that we can go on to some of these responses. So please forgive me. I want to get to this last little piece, and that is on Israel, Reform Judaism in Israel. So who would, Lori, you want to read this?
Yeah. We are Israel, a people aspiring to holiness, singled out through our ancient covenant and our unique history among the nations to be witnesses to God's presence. We are linked by that covenant and that history to all Jews in every age and place. We are committed to the mitzvah of Ahava Yisrael, love for the Jewish people, and to Kalal Yisrael, the entirety of the community of Israel, recognizing that Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Bazeh, all Jews are responsible for one another. We reach out to all Jews across ideological and geographical boundaries. Just what we've been talking about.
Exactly.
We embrace religious and cultural pluralism as an expression of the vitality of Jewish communal life in Israel and the diaspora. We pledge to fulfill Reform Judaism's historic commitment to the complete equality of women and men in Jewish life. We are an inclusive community, opening doors to Jewish life to people of all ages, to varied kinds of families, to all, regardless of their sexual orientation, to Gerim, those who have converted to Judaism, and to all individuals and families, including the intermarried who strive to create a Jewish home. We believe that we must not only open doors for those ready to enter our faith, but also to actively encourage those who are seeking a spiritual home to find it in Judaism. We are committed to strengthening the people Israel by supporting individuals and families in the creation of homes rich in Jewish learning and observance. We are committed to strengthening the people Israel by making the synagogue central to Jewish communal life, so that it may elevate the spiritual, intellectual, and cultural quality of our lives. We are committed to Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, and rejoice in its accomplishments. We affirm the unique qualities of living in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and encourage Aliyah, immigration to Israel. We are committed to a vision of the state of Israel that promotes full civil, human, and religious rights for all its inhabitants, and that strives for a lasting peace between Israel and its neighbors. We are committed to a vision of the state of Israel that promotes full civil, human, and religious rights for, I just read that. We are committed to promoting and strengthening progressive Judaism in Israel, which will enrich the spiritual life of the Jewish state and its people. We affirm that both Israel and diaspora Jewry should remain vibrant and interdependent communities, as we urge Jews who reside outside Israel to learn Hebrew as a living language and to make periodic visits to Israel in order to study and to deepen their relationship to the land and its people. So do we affirm that Israeli Jews have much to learn from the religious life of diaspora Jewish communities.
Okay, so I know that one last little sentence here.
We are committed to furthering progressive Judaism throughout the world as a meaningful religious way of life for the Jewish people. In all these ways and more, Israel gives meaning and purpose to our lives.
Right. So we covered God, Torah, and Israel. And I think you look at that statement, and we should be very proud of that statement. It's also a challenge for us. There's a lot there that we need to live up to, but you can say, that's what it means to be a Reformed Jew. That's not, Julia, you show that to anyone, and how could that possibly be Jewish life? That's not. And I think it's something that affirms a sense not only of authenticity, but a sense of vision and mission as a proud part of the Jewish world. And yes, there are those who choose to live and express their Judaism by being Hasidic or Haredi or conservative or Orthodox or Reconstructionist. Okay, that's all right. You know what? Vive la différence, right? It's okay to have different points of view. We're enriched by that. We're challenged by that. We're informed by that. As it says in the Talmud, Elu divrei Elohim chayim. This one and that one are all interesting and important viewpoints that give us a fuller view of what it means to be a Jew, means to be a caring, loving person. So I thought by having this reaffirmed in our own sense, then when we hear some comment that comes from a critic of the of Reform Judaism, or someone who is upset about what the High Court in Israel has just ruled, and they say something about Reform or conservative Judaism, we can stand up and say creditably, these are not just words, but I think each of you in your own way, and I've had the privilege of knowing you, that you have embodied those principles and you're living up to those principles. And I think we have a great deal for which we can feel proud about as Reformed Jews.
Rabbi, I want to get...
Go ahead, Alan.
I became aware this week of a channel called the Jewish Broadcasting Network. Used to be Shalom TV. Now it's JBN, and it's amazing. They have the 92nd Street Y. They have interviews. I saw one last night with one of the women who was part of the Women for the Wall, and it was just fascinating. And I just want to let people know about it. Thank you.
How do you get to it?
It's on Comcast at 1684.
Okay.
I don't know what other venues it's on, but it's the Jewish Broadcasting Network.
Alan, thank you so much. Mel and Roberta, you have your hands raised.
Yeah. Yes. Is there somewhere we can find the platform that we can look at it again and reread it?
Absolutely. And you know what? Probably the best. I know it sounds a little bit. Send me an email, and but it's also, here's another easy way. It's on the Central Conference of American Rabbis, so you can go to their website. And by the way, that's a great look at that one, and also the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism. It has a wonderful website, and not just for things like this, the platform, but also responsa literature, also recipes, and also calendar and news events, et cetera, et cetera. But if anybody emails me, I'll send you this copy, because what I did is I formatted it so it's a little bit easier to read. and all the rest. But it'd be my pleasure to send that to you. I want to thank again Yoni for being here and helping us through. A real quick reminder to everyone, all year long, for a full year, Rabbi Jordy and Dan and I, we've been doing services in the building because I wanted us to be able to read Torah from the chapel, to lead the services in the chapel and the sanctuary. And last Friday, we had 50 some people in the Zohar sanctuary for confirmation. It was wonderful. And so Dafka, after a full year of no matter what with this pandemic, of being in the chapel and the sanctuary, this Friday and Saturday probably won't, because of this crazy storm. And we didn't want to put security guards or anyone. We don't even know what's going to happen. Who knows? It's Denver. I mean, nothing happens, right? So anyway, so for the first time, we're going to be, it's gorgeous, right? Yoni says it's gorgeous right now. So we're gonna look outside, we're gonna feel embarrassed. But okay, so don't be mad at us. We will do a virtual service Friday night and Shabbat morning. But God willing, the following weekend, if you want to come in and be with us, just sign up. The registration, you had to do it for each of the services. We will love to see you guys back in, and I look forward to seeing you guys next Thursday as well. Yoni, any final words?
I think you got it. We're gonna see a big change very soon, but enjoy the sunshine while you can.
All right, guys. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.
Ronnie.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.